thank you so much for sticking around at this late hour. I hope to welcome you today, and I will present to you about the history of psychotechnics, and in the particular case of a Psychotechnical Institute in Groningen. In the current literature, this institute is not very well known and researched, despite its unique nature and context. This institute was directed by a man of science, who I will talk to you about later, with a high methodological standards. Yet he was running an institute that was specifically meant to cater to societal demands and questions. As such, this case offers an interesting insight into the tensions that arise when scientific and theoretical concerns are met by pragmatic and societal demands. In the literature on psychotechnics, we often get to hear about success stories. How psychotechnicians did a great job at gaining access to professional spaces and contended with other experts such as physicians to establish their area of expertise. How they experienced resistance and had to fight for every inch of status and prestige. But despite all of this, managed to establish themselves as experts. On the contrary, we'll also get narratives in which the psychotechnicians play the role of the bad guys. They are aiding the rising capitalist powers to extort their workers and to help get rid of those who offer resistance. Through their tests and selection and methods of rationalization, they get to decide who is included and, more importantly, who is excluded. Thereby, psychotechnicians acted as gatekeepers and accomplices to those already in power. Today, I want to tell a completely different story. I believe the Dutch case and sources of a Groninger Institute can give insight into a unique context. Its director acted in ways that allows us to question these common narratives, particularly related to the roles of psychotechnicians, but even on some broader questions about power and democracy. Before getting into the details of this institute, let me tell you how this talk fits into my dissertation. My PhD is about Gerard Heijmans, the first Dutch psychologist who has founded the first Dutch laboratory in Groningen. He developed a temperamental typology in which came to be known as the Heijmans cube. It's still working. My dissertation is on the role the cube played within society. I will focus on 4 areas of application. It was, for example, used in teacher training programs, debates around women's psychology and voting rights, in newspaper reports on judicial trials, where expert witnesses called on the cube to discuss questions of accountability. And finally, it was used in vocational guidance within the psychotechnical context that I will focus on today. The term psychotechnics was first coined by William Stern and then popularized by Hugo Münsterberg in the 1910s in Germany. This Dutch brochure describes it as follows. I think you can see it already. Psychotechnics is the application of the results of scientific psychological research for practical ends. Industrialization and the rise of new technologies gave rise to an explosion in the variety of jobs, as well as the number of people in need of an occupation. In comparison, for the Netherlands, this process happened relatively late. And as necessary technologies and expertise could be flown in from neighboring countries, this led to an even more abrupt transition than in most other countries. One of these typical new vocations in psychotechnical research was, for example, that of the telephone operator, which for some reason was mostly done by women. Psychotechnics was practiced in many countries around this time, although in every country the emphasis seems to be slightly different. Psychotechnics had a very strong basis in countries such as Spain and Switzerland under the leading figures such as Mera and Clapeyret. And of course, a familiar example is Binet, who laid the foundations of the intelligence test in France and in an educational setting. And the test then received an enormous application in America in the military selection under the name of Army Alpha and Army Beta. So, in the Dutch context, we again find a slightly different emphasis in how psychotechnics played a role in society. To understand it, it's good to stay a little few words about the Dutch cultural tendencies. Briefly put, the Netherlands was a country of collaboration and compromises. We are known from the polder model, a political model that is closely tied to water management. Throughout Dutch history, it was essential to have good water management to make sure livelihoods would not be swept away by the floods. If one party refused to cooperate or not to stick to their agreements, commitments, or maintenance, that would put everyone in direct danger. As such, the political term polder model is often used with even rather negative connotations to describe the very slow decision-making process in which all parties needed to be heard. As a natural result of this mutual dependence, hierarchical structures tended to be less pronounced, and the assertion of authority tended to be challenged. A sober, down-to-earth, unassuming approach to life was highly valued, whereas any expression of superiority tended to be frowned upon and called out. Another final thing to note about the organization of the society is that it was highly pillarized. Everything was organized around pillars: the Roman Catholic, the Protestant, the liberal, and the social pillar. That meant that everyone attended the schools, the sports, the occupational organizations, and consumed the news outlets from those specific pillars. Within this context, we now turn to the Dr. Bos Stichting. The erection of the Dr. Bos Stichting was the direct result of one specific event, that is, the death of Dr. Dirk Bos. Dirk Bos was a highly appreciated politician and founder of the VVD. Personally, he was a big promoter of education for the general public, and his party introduced legislation promoting social welfare, such as pensions and universal suffrage. Within this context, to celebrate his memory, they erected a fund, and with that money, a non-profit organization was to be founded. It was reported that it should be an institute of a general nature with a social goal and of pedagogical value. An institute who will be at the service of the entire populace without distinguishing between beliefs or status. It was to be directed by Henry Brugmans, Heiman's student and successor to his chair in psychology. So what did this institute do? Well, this mission was operationalized in various areas. The institute was to develop typical vocational testing series, such as this research for the Stork machine factory. As it was meant to cater to the general public, it also engaged in diagnostic activities and corresponded with parents about any questions surrounding the educational and vocational potential of their children. In this correspondence, I want to make brief note of the very personally engaged way that Brugmans corresponded with these parents. He showed a genuine interest in the well-being of the children and went far beyond the strict requirements of this task. Brugmans also combined his two positions by using the stichting to provide psychotechnical training to psychology students, and also made use of, for example, the association tests that Annette published on. And finally, an important job was to publish on all this research and make it publicly available. These publications served several important functions. First of all, it related to the public task of making all the acquired knowledge available to the public so that others would be able to benefit from all the successes as well as the dead ends that Brugmans encountered in his research. Another important function was to act as propaganda for the psychotechnical applications and to showcase what this new science could offer society. Oh, was I behind?
It's about 5 minutes to go.
5 minutes to go, okay. Well, then I now get to my case.
Okay.
Because one thing that psychotechnicians could offer society was, let me see where I was, oh yeah, to help deal with all these new developments. For example, there was a rapid growth in the public and private use of cars. That introduced the question whether just anyone should be allowed to operate these complex machines, and to what extent the car use should be regulated. In 1924, new legislation was introduced on this issue. It stated that a license should be issued, and before that could happen, people needed to be tested for any mental and physical defects. Years earlier, Germany had already introduced psychotechnical institutes that were charged with testing military drivers and tram personnel. The success of these institutes in reducing accidents and preventing damage had made a big impression in the Netherlands. Newspapers reported how it was necessary for social as well as economic reasons to install similar testing services in the Netherlands. This all led to the Dutch Society for the Promotion of Medicine being charged to figure out how to deal with this problem. A committee was erected, chaired by Brugmans and including psychotechnicians from various psychotechnical institutes in the Netherlands and other experts. This committee was to look into the question of how testing could be done, arranged in a way that it would not entail too many financial costs, and to look into what kind of facilities were needed and what would be required of this testing. So in this case, instead of needing to fight for their inclusion, the way had been paved by the German success story. Although the question was initially put to the physicians, they in turn put together a committee mostly composed by psychotechnicians. With this golden opportunity, did they rise to the occasion? No. That's the short answer. The author emphasizes the risk that in such scientific efforts to find practical solutions, a down-to-earth and sober approach is necessary. Without this, the results are doomed to be disappointing, and this seemed to have been the case also here. So what went wrong? Well, the straightforward answer is they took too long. It was an urgent issue in need of an urgent solution, and the committee was unable to offer the report in time. The public grew impatient and started their own efforts to resolve this issue, rather than to wait indefinitely for the results. So then, why did the committee take so long to publish this report? Well, the committee was made up of various psychotechnical institutes, which also happened to be tied up in this pillarized system. Professor Roels, being a Roman Catholic, Van Weyenburg a Protestant, they all had different ideas and approaches to psychotechnical practice. In his letter to Van Weyenburg, Brugmans comments that his views are being so extremely different that including these views in the report would be very problematic. So the research itself was actually completed within months, but we can easily see how this bickering over the details of the report led to many more months of delay. As Brugmans himself laments, with this free-spirited Dutchman, one does not achieve much in terms of organization. So now I come to my conclusions. Right? Yeah. It is clear that the polder model, in this case, didn't work wonders for the effectiveness with which the committee functioned, especially the democratic and diplomatic approach that Brugmans took in chairing this committee. From his leadership position, he might have written the report as he saw fit, rather than having endless discussions in hope of reaching a consensus, while considering the options of submitting a separate report. We may wonder what would have happened if he had taken a more authoritarian approach in chairing this committee. That leaves us with some interesting conclusions that run counter to the common narrative about psychotechnics and styles of leadership as well. In this case, it seems that the physicians were eager to grant the psychotechnicians with the opportunity to prove themselves and their ability to solve societal problems. Yet, the egalitarian and democratic approach to leadership seems to, in this case, have been to the detriment of the success of the committee. I hope that this Dutch case was therefore able to offer a new insight into the psychotechnical practice and how tensions between scientific prudence, diplomacy, and social demands can have a surprising interplay.
Thank you very much. This final one of these 5 very well organized presentations. Some quick questions for this final paper and maybe for some of the others.
But I have no specific questions, but just a consideration. Because psychotechnics was very important in Italy during the fascism. And
Psychotechnics?
was very important in Italy during the fascism because during the fascism psychology was at the basic level, and we have no applied psychology with big theoretical conception, because psychotechnics was tolerated more by philosophers and by theologists. In my opinion, psychotechnics, also in the Dutch case, or in general, Dutch case, was more more connected with psychophysiology. Okay, when you say Binet was made psychotechnics, I think no. Binet was a higher psychology of intelligence, of higher processes. Psychotechnics don't study intelligence. They study reflex, the study of attention, using machine, and so on. In Italy, we have a lot of research about psychotechnics, and I define in my first article psychotechnics as sort of psychology without theory.
Okay, thank you.
No comment. We have another question back here.
So the committee the whole thing falls apart and they don't really get the job done. Do they just kind of give up afterwards and go, okay, well, I guess we're never going to get this off the ground? Psychotechnics is dead. And I ask because I just happen to know that Munsterberg, when he was at Harvard, he tried to get a psychotechnics thing, and the very first job they gave them was something called the Cambridge Street Lamp Lighting Committee, and there you know the story. And they're just like, these guys are nuts, this is not working, it's a complete waste of time. But then Munsterberg says, okay, I'm going to take this to the people, and he starts consulting on criminal investigations and cinema and all this kind of stuff, so he goes around the... So do these guys, so what do they do next, I guess is what I'm asking.
I think you can use that.
Yes, thank you very much.
It's not very good.
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, I must admit that so they published the report in this case, but yeah, it falls a bit on deaf ears by the time that they publish it. No one is no longer interested, and they already figured a bit out themselves. But it didn't mean that psychotechnics in the Netherlands in general was dead, because the institute went on until at least 1938, and by that time, Brugmans was really, eager to propagate this effort, and it ended not because of reduced interest necessarily, because the last few years he had a lot of expositions, for example, where thousands of people showed up in the Netherlands, so really it was quite popular. The problem was that the fund that was paying the stichting, they didn't want to pay for it anymore, and this is why the institute ended. So in this case, it didn't mean the end of psychotechnics in general, but of course it was a big bunk in the, what could have been a nice success story, but now was a bit anticlimactic, let's say.
So they never got another job from the state or anything like that?
No. This looks like the most official kind of task that they got, and at least this institute didn't. But I know that, for example, the Dutch Postal Office had their own private laboratory. And also Philips Vloeilampenfabriek also had a private laboratory, so it was kind of a big thing, but more not necessarily these institutes, but then in private laboratories.